So tell me the story of that watch.
Yeah, when you visit a new city, you are inevitably on this kind of wander, and you're much more open to these kind of serendipitous moments because you just are not familiar with the place. And so we were just walking the city, and we walked into just a random watch store, mom and pop kind of place. And we were just looking at all the interesting and weird vintage watches that this person was selling, because you don't get to see so much old stuff from where we're from in Singapore. And then Karin noticed this particular watch, and I was attracted to it because, it's an old vintage brand, Bulova, but they particularly made an interesting watch movement called the Accutron, which is not, it's an electronic movement, but it's not based in quartz, and it offers this kind of sweeping hand. So the seconds are not deadbeat seconds like a quartz watch. So just purely from an aesthetic and a technical standpoint, I was interested in it. So we went up to the person, and I asked him how much this watch was for. And from that point on, he kind of gave us like this really interesting history about starting off with the moon watches and how Bulova was one of the three organizations chosen for a moon watch. And then he shared a little bit more about his past. And apparently he's been at this store that's just down the street from here for about 60 years now. He worked as a watchmaker for Piaget. He studied watchmaking in London and in Switzerland. So, he was sharing this really rich kind of accounting of not just his life, but in the context of where he works, where he makes a living, the store that he's owned for 60 years. And you could see right away that there was a very blurry line between, his life and the passion he has for his kind of practice.
Yeah, you can definitely tell it by the way that he was speaking about the watch, speaking about the watches in general, or like his job, but also the way just like how the whole shop was set up, how he was sitting behind the counter, that this is definitely his passion, way more than just a profession or a job that makes money. And I think in many ways you could almost, and of course we only had like a 10, 15 minutes interaction with him, but it almost felt like that's the kind of relationship you want to have with your job. If you can hit this point where you, I don't think he makes millions there, but he definitely seems he is making well enough. He's enjoying himself, and there's a strong interest and connection even after 60 years. So for me, if I can say that about whatever I'll be doing when I'm 60 or whatever how old he was, I hit jackpot, I would say. I think that has to be the ultimate goal for all of us, to feel this kind of connection and interest for a job that you have done already for over decades.
Yeah.
I think then we...
Nice. Actually, that's
that's
really interesting for me. I've lived in this country for so many years. I didn't know that we actually have a watch market and people who are actually dedicated and they love what they do in this specific industry. So I'm definitely going to check out that shop. So, Jeffrey, Karin, thank you so much, guys, for joining me in this conversation. It's great to have you here. So, what is this podcast about? I aim to make a series in order to discuss with people who are in the creative fields, who are in the design fields, who are in the technology fields, people who have accomplished something in their career, and I want to hear basically their story. I want to hear how you guys started. I want to hear how you guys deal with your clients. I want to hear how you guys think. I want to understand basically the different steps that you took in your life that led you here. So how about you guys start by basically telling us about yourselves?
Sure. Karin, do you want to go first?
Happy to kick it off. Let's just start somewhere and we'll fill in the gaps as we go. So maybe let's start where I am at the moment, and I can look back and I can look forward. So I am currently one of the partners and design directors of Chemistry, which is a strategic design consultancy based both in Singapore and Amsterdam. And we are a team of multidisciplinary designers, around 15 people strong, working across various sectors, public and private, from healthcare to hospitality, tech, one of the projects we're doing right now is the immigration experience in Singapore. So it's really, really diverse, as are our skills. And that has kept me busy for the last, I guess, 13 years or so. Where I started was somewhat very different, but also not. Looking back, it makes complete sense. Looking forward, I would have not thought that I ended up where I was, which maybe is exactly why you're asking that. So I originally started studying advertising, don't ask me why, way back in Vienna, and got my first master's in classic graphic design, communications, and advertising, which I already, as I was studying, realized is not what I want to spend my life doing. And I actually never worked as a full-time graphic designer. And I very quickly started to shift and see where are ways where I can apply design in a different means. Having said that, it took me a while to figure out what it would be, and it took me a while to get comfortable with the feeling of what it could be. And I have to say that meeting Jeff and doing my second master together with him was definitely one of the catalysts to actually go even further. So, and he will definitely tell more about that. We lived and worked across Europe. We did a second master, where I did a second master in London that looked at experience design, broadly speaking. And that already was exactly this idea, to see how we can actually expand what it means to practice design. My first master, and still nowadays in many design practices and in education, is very siloed, looking like at a certain disciplines. You're a graphic designer, you're a product designer, and you sit in your little sliver of the practice. And I think what is exciting about the second master and the work that I've done since is about actually bridging that and working across disciplines and working across sectors. And maybe I stop here for a bit and let Jeff add on, and then we can just weave on from there.
Yeah, for me, I have a somewhat similar background as Karin. We did do some graduate studies together. We worked a lot together. So we both worked together at the Office for Metropolitan Architecture, working in architecture. I was also an advisor and partner at chemistry, but currently I'm an associate professor at the Singapore Institute of Technology, and really looking at design education as this kind of lateral competency, that it doesn't matter what your field of expertise is. It's something that has utility. Design has something that has utility, even if you don't practice design, if you're not a designer per se. Maybe to speak a little bit about what Karin mentioned. I think what I find interesting, and we had a lecture at the university here, your university, recently, talking about some of these topics, and looking at how design practice can influence increasingly complex systems. So when you start off studying, or you start your career, my career as well, I was actually interested in the legacy play, meaning to say, like, I want to make something that will stand the test of time, that will last longer than me in a lot of ways. And I felt that creative practice, making design, making art, was one of those ways to do that, because you're kind of manifesting something, and that something has material, it has weight, even if it's ephemeral, even if it's a video. There is something that is brought into reality, and so that was the very attractive thing for me. But as I started to kind of practice that and work some more, I realized that what I make can be something on its own, but it can also be a component to facilitate much more complex systems. So now, how does my design interact with, an organization or other collaborators? How does that contribute to approaching challenges in a much more complex way? And that's when we think about how our design can affect. You can work on objects, you can work on images, but you can also work on experiences. You can work on interfaces. But designers can also work on designing policy and communities and governance, or how businesses run. So it's situating your practice within these kind of systems.
That's very interesting. I want to hear about your understanding of design, because I don't think there is a super strict definition, or it's probably a definition that keeps changing. So these ideas that you guys have, I guess you are implementing them through your company that you're running in Singapore. Maybe you can tell us a little bit about the company, like what kind of clients and what kind of services you guys were offering.
maybe I can get started on that. I think what is interesting is to also then look at the company a little bit in the historic sense. So chemistry has been around for now 23 years. Yeah, 23 years. And it started off originally as this very classic design company that I think might fit with the image that most people have when they think about design. So it was started by two product designers and a graphic designers who were ex-Philips. So he used to work for Philips Design, and it was basically looking at designing irons, designing mobile phones, designing electronic appliances, and doing not only the product design, but also the branding, the packaging design, all that. So that was very much where chemistry started. And I think that's very much in line with what many people understand as design. You design a object or an asset of everyday life and make it as functional, as good looking as possible. What has happened then subsequently in the last, I guess, 2 decades or so across, or even longer, across Singapore, that company, but design in general, is that it has expanded and has shifted further and further, you could say, up the value stream, where you say, okay, we not only as designers want to come in and solve a brief, we actually want to be involved in what this brief is made of. Like, what are we actually focusing on? What is the problem? What's the area we want to focus on? So not just like, how will this iron or this mobile phone work, but do we actually need a mobile phone? Is that the right response to that? Is there something higher up that we actually can look at slightly differently? And this has very much led into the idea of strategic design consulting. And of course, the approach of getting there is using a human-centered design approach, meaning you will put the people that you're designing for, and at this point, it was still very much we design for someone, at the core of it. Meaning that we want to conduct research to understand what their needs are, their challenges, what will actually drive them to use this product, what will make their behavior really sticky and continues to use the product or service or whatever it might be. So from the start of like we just create the products and print material, etc., we move to, okay, we're going to have this human-centered collaborative approach where we do research, we come up with ideas, we test them, and through this process come up with the actual solution. And this, by definition, has also then shifted and expanded in the case of chemistry. But again, as you can see it more globally, that design is not just this one discipline. So like I'm going to create an app or I'm going to create a product, but there's actually a need to overlap and collaborate between these disciplines.
So maybe it's worth mentioning too, chemistry is a design consultancy, but we are outcome agnostic.
Yeah.
Meaning to say that we're not just making interfaces, for instance. Because if we focused on web development or designing front end, then all the solutions to every question we would face would be a new website. So it's important for us to be design agnostic because the challenge may beg for all sorts of different solutions. It may involve a physical space. It may involve a digital experience. It also may involve policy and governance, like how to run this thing. It may involve a new business model. So when you think of our team, we design across disciplines because the solution should not be defined, at the onset. It should be the best possible outcome, whatever that outcome is. So we're design agnostic in that sense. And it's a tricky rope to walk because I would say the real value of a designer ultimately is going to be that they make things, that there is a kind of craft output. A lot of designers don't want to be associated with craft so much anymore. They want to move towards the kind of strategic thinking, the systems thinking, future forecasting, basically becoming a management consultant.
Yeah.
But the one differentiator that a design consultant will have with a management consultant is that they can begin to prototype. They can make things, they can test those things and iterate. So it's very important for me to tell all the young designers that I ever talk to is that, yes, you should be moving into a more intellectual space with your design considerations. However, you should hold on to your craft part because that's the key differentiator.
Okay. Can you maybe share some case studies so we can understand a little bit better how you guys approach?
Yeah.
So I think just to put into perspective some of the things that we shared, we do, and I mentioned it briefly before, we actually do a lot of work in healthcare. So Singapore, where our headquarters is a very interesting market because in Singapore, you have on one hand a lot of regional headquarters of MNCs, so a lot of private sector companies, but you also have a very mature, in that sense, public sector field because the various public agencies are very keen and very well set up to collaborate with designers. So design thinking, human-centered design has been very much integrated into the workings of the public sector in Singapore, which leads to them very actively collaborating with companies like ourselves on improving and continuously pushing public service in Singapore, including healthcare. So that means, for example, that we have been involved in various projects, for example, bringing together architects and urban planners and hospital planners on developing, for example, new hospitals in Singapore, where you on one hand have the physicality, the construction of you're going to build another 200-bed hospital with like long-term care and outpatient clinics, etc., etc. But then we coming in as designers to also look at the non-medical patient experiences. So for example, how do I get my medications when I walk into the pharmacy? What happens when I visit the outpatient clinic? How do I go through the patient service center? And those are always, or very often, problem spaces that bring together, as Jeff was talking about, various disciplines. So there's very often a service aspect of that, like what's actually a user experience. As a patient walking in, I'm very tech savvy, I'm not so tech savvy, so looking at different user or persona types, what will I do? What's my journey? There is a spatial component to that. How do I actually design the space? Are there counters? Are there no counters? Are there seating areas or not? There's a digital aspect to that. Will this whole thing be aided with digital interfaces or journeys that are sitting on an app? Is there a kiosk? Is there a variety of journeys that can serve different communities or different kind of tech savvy or different demographics? So as designers, it's a really rich and really interesting problem that we can start to solve with, where we can be agnostic. It doesn't have to be an app, but we have the skills to actually do that. And through the process, we can work with the different stakeholders, the patients, the healthcare professionals, to find out what's the status quo, what works, what doesn't, what's the future vision, and how can we get there. Bring something to life, as he was saying, very quickly through rough prototypes using paper, cardboard, wood, and test it out. And that would be like a typical kind of project that we do that on one hand is very strategic, thinking about the hospital of the future, but also very tangible because there will be actual designs, spatial designs, service blueprints, interfaces at the end of it.
Okay. Yeah. So you guys actually designed, like, it was the healthcare center, was it a hospital?
Yeah.
So we designed a few different systems, everything from like the taxi stand, because, you know, when a patient just had an operation and needs to get home, that experience needs to be considered. Things like the pharmacy, but also like the digital layer. So for instance, how would they pay their bills? You're thinking at it as we were trying to think about it from a systems perspective, and a particular user, like someone who works there, a nurse, for instance, or a patient, what is their journey through the day? What are the rough parts of that journey? How can we make that journey smoother for them? And that involves a multimodality of things, like everything from using the printer to, you know, waiting in line for, you know, at the cafeteria, to how do I pay my bills? Can I use credit card versus cash? Am I waiting in line for, you know, my next spot? All of these different parts of the journey should be considered.
And I guess by designing all of that, you need to be really early in the process.
I would argue that it's designing it, but really it's co-creation, because we're not, and no designer can claim that, we're not experts in making hospitals. We are also not medical doctors or trained nurses, and so in that respect, all of these solutions that we come up with are, yes, crafted and designed by us, but they're really actually co-created with the users on the ground. We need expert inputs. We need everyday user inputs, customer or patient inputs, in order to provide solutions that work best for them. And it would be very presumptuous as anyone to say, this is how it should be and you should like it. And I think that's where the designer comes in regards to being able to facilitate co-creation.
Okay, trying to understand this a little bit. So you guys helped design this, and then let's say that you decided that the best place for the pharmacy, let's say that the people collect their medicine after they leave from the doctor is ideally going to be placed here. So you go to the architect and tell him, according to our designs, according to our that's where we think it should be. Like, how does that work?
Okay, maybe that's a very good point, and I think that's a good counter to that. So I think as much as we talk here about this like freedom of experimentation and trying things out, there always is in any project certain limitations and boundaries, and I think that also makes design interesting, and we can get into that later. There is the meta level of like how is a project set up, how is an organization set up in order to make the design successful, but we can get into that later. For us, for a project like the healthcare campus that we designed in Singapore, in the north of Singapore, to make it successful, it was important that we were involved early on. So just for some time frame, we worked on this project around 2016 to 2018. It opened up end of last year, 2023. There were also some delays due to COVID, but it's a huge hospital. It takes time. Yeah. So you have to be involved early in the process to have some leeway and some space for change. Having said that, of course, you can't throw over everything. So, for example, in this case, what you just mentioned, we knew what a pharmacy was. So we couldn't shift the pharmacy. We knew how much space there was for the pharmacy. We knew certain amenities. But within those limitations, we had freedom.
Okay.
Of course, it's again healthcare. So there's also, and that's interesting from a design point of view, and like often designers work within limitations. You can design a great user experience, but there's some regulations, like certain medications, you need to see a pharmacist that tells you what are the challenges or dangers with this medication. So you need to design that in. You can't have everything, it's going to be delivered to your home, no problem.
Yeah.
So understanding those boundaries that are either from laws or from regulations, that are from like the built environment or just like budget, timeline, etc., and being able to be creative within those boundaries is also one of the key things that a designer has to master, working within those boundaries.
Okay, very interesting. So basically you need to see as you go along the limitations, and then you need to readjust.
Yeah. Some you can push, but some you can't.
I mean, maybe that is maybe you could say that's one fundamental difference between creative practice in fine art versus creative practice in design.
In design, yeah.
Design very much works with constraints. There's a brief, there's usually a client, although there's something called clientless projects that we can talk about too, but usually there's a client. And so all of these constraints will affect the way that you design. Whereas an artist, for instance, maybe that is a more personal exploration. Maybe the constraints are personally imposed or environmentally imposed. But yeah.
Okay. And just out of curiosity, so this is considered now to be part of design. So this is conducted by actual designers.
Yeah.
And in your experience, how many years has this been going on where they allocate designers to help with this? And as a second part of the question, who did this before?
As much as I would love to say like we came up with that, we definitely did not. I'm sure Jeff can give more like of the academic background, but you could say that like one of the first companies that successfully commercialized and made it big with this idea of design thinking, human-centered design as a strategic tool that also fundamentally brings in stakeholder into the process to make it co-creative, has been ideal. And they have been doing this for like 20 years or so. Yeah. I would say that there has been definitely on a global level this push, this change, this transformation in design. You will definitely see more mature markets and less mature markets for various reasons. So for example, Singapore didn't have a very strong design tradition previously in a Western sense. I mean, there's always been, of course, like indigenous craft, etc. But I guess in the last 30, 40 years, there wasn't design tradition in that sense, which made it then also very fertile ground to have someone like IDEO come in and bring this methodology that was very readily taken up by the government. So in this sense, then the human-centered and user experience design practice in Singapore, especially also in the public sector field, is very strong. In other countries where you maybe have a stronger classical design practice, where you have very clear differentiation between graphic design and product design, etc., when you have established structures, it's more difficult to actually come in.
Yeah, I think Singapore is freed from the baggage of a historical design provenance. So, for instance, if you're in Italy, you know, their design can be, and historically is, you know, beautiful furniture and beautiful textiles and glass blowing and, you know, very much rooted in craft. Singapore does not have that baggage of craft. Therefore, their flavor of design was really looking at it from a systems and a participatory perspective.
Okay.
Because the government is the permeability between the citizenship and the government is very thin. You have very good social services. You can interact with all sorts of government agencies in a very direct way, actually.
Okay.
And this is enabled through, digital services, but really enabled by their adoption of human-centered design. Human-centered design is a way to understand your audiences, your users, your customers, but also a way to understand your citizens. So in a sense, for I was going to say company, for a country like Singapore, it makes a lot of sense to employ design thinking because it allows them to have these very rich engagements with,
And
their
control
citizens.
risk.
Yeah, and
And,
it's also
yeah.
mitigating risk in a very
Yeah.
big way.
And we all know that Singapore likes to
Very
work
impossible.
in systems and everything is organized in a way
Exactly.
that fits together. No, it's very interesting for me because, for example, I don't claim I know, but in Cyprus, I don't think like public services, when they actually start designing like buildings or services in general, they employ a design agency to kind of think over the experience. And that's why I was asking whether, like, do you think this is common practice everywhere, or would you say that this is common practice in specific places and specific, I guess, markets, we would
Yeah.
say?
It definitely is very specific, and I mean, I by no means have researched that, but just like one thing that I was thinking about in our conversations also the last few days, because we were talking about that, is that it has many things coming together. And for example, from my personal experience, I think it was also very much the journey to understand what role you play as a designer. My very first degree, which was still in Austria, which I think is, and I haven't worked in a long time, so don't take my word for it, but is a lot more still traditional, very siloed. So me being educated as a graphic designer or a communication designer was very much about you as a designer creating great design, whatever that might mean, like very functional, very good looking, etc., on a high level of craft. Then doing my second master's in the UK, that already shifted because it was a lot more around, first of all, the master was a different topic. It was about bringing different disciplines together and having this friction, having this, okay, yes, we're all creative, we're all in a creative practice, but what are our differences and how can we actually learn from our differences? But then also very much the self-reflectiveness of where did you fail, what did you learn from your failures, etc. And as I moved through my career, I think what I started to realize more and more through the kind of education that I had, but also the exposure of organizations and clients, is that it's your craft, it's the skill that you bring, it's how you can collaborate with others, but then also getting more and more understanding of like the context that you work within, not just the solution that you create, like whatever, if it's a chair, a service blueprint or digital interface, it actually doesn't matter. It's really more, okay, who do you work with, who do you work for, and what's the context that you hand the solution over. So it's not just like you as a designer, as a craftsperson, as a creative, but also you as a facilitator. Can you actually help the organization, no matter if it's a public service agency or private company? Are they able to take your idea, take your design, and then bring it to life and keep it alive?
I mean, every designer works within the context of an ecosystem.
Yeah.
Let's say you're a chair maker. So you make a chair, but that chair is part of an ecosystem you designed for it. Who's going to sit in that chair? Is this chair going to be at a table? What is the room that this chair is going to be in? What is the house that this room is going to hold? What is the neighborhood and community where that house is in, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And so if you think about your design practice, no matter how simple it is, it can always be situated within wider and wider ecosystems. And the designer, especially now in the 21st century, needs to or has begun to think about those ecosystems in which their design exists. So even if you're designing just, I don't know, a graphic designer and you design a poster, there's such a heavy context that can be understood in that poster. And the more you understand that ecosystem, the better you can design.
So a simple question is like, what is the message on your poster? Who is paying for the poster? Who will see the poster? What's the call to action of the poster? Very simplified, but exactly that. And I think that's something that very often is still not properly covered in education. And also often takes a while, and it took me almost 20 years of practice for the designer to really start questioning yourself. Like, what am I actually doing? What's the wider context that I work within? And I think it's a very important question.
Okay, yeah, I want to go over the landscape of design in a second, but before, maybe you can expand on a little bit more about what are the case studies or maybe some other clients, just so we get like
Yeah.
yeah,
Some more ideas.
yeah.
Let me just maybe give you a few quick examples, and then you can let us know if we can give more detail. So another, I think, very interesting project that's maybe more private sector. We have been, for example, working with several organizations in the financial service sector, both from credit cards to insurances, looking specifically at their in-house innovation capabilities, meaning how can they in-house, like either their design teams or their transformation teams, how can we help them not only upskill themselves, and that can be on one hand training, that can be providing them with research insights or with relevant assets like personas, etc., to get better at doing what they're supposed to do, but also looking at the whole organization. How can you even start thinking about what it means to be innovative and well set up as a design-led organization? So that's one whole set of things that we did. On the other hand, we have been now working with one of the Singapore government agencies, IMDA. It's the Infocom Media Development Authority. They, for example, are running an incubator where they have startups from the tech space across various applications. And we have been now running since 2016 or so. Quite some time, this coaching services in UI and UX, where we work with these startups and providing them very targeted coaching. That can range from redesigning your wireframe to we sit down and rethink your whole business proposition.
I think it's important to note too that while we do a lot of client-based work, we do try to make room for what we call clientless work, meaning to say that instead of a client being an external force, can we be our own clients? And therefore, can we do projects that personally interest us? And we enable that through, grants, looking for grants, looking for funding, much like academics do. Of course, we're still a profit-based organization, so it's something that we can't do like full time, but we try to do it to, I guess, remain relevant and interested in the practice. I think what's interesting too about the way that we are designing, and I think a lot of the design ecosystem is moving towards, is this idea of change or transformation or transition. I feel that a lot of the times when I employ my design skills, my design knowledge, it is to think about change or transformation. So irregardless of that is, thinking of a new object and how that affects change, to thinking about whole services and whole policy changes in order to enable change to happen. I find that our work is increasingly revolving around that. So the examples that Karin has given, like where we've looked at internal innovation teams, where we've developed entrepreneurship programs for big tech companies, it's really because they are thinking about constant change and transformation. How can they stay relevant? How can they stay nimble in a constantly transforming and changing world? And in order for those organizations to keep pace with the world's change, they also need to change. And so we as designers were very much involved in facilitating that experimentation of change.
So maybe a very quick example to what I just mentioned. So we worked, for example, with Konica Minolta as well as with HP on, Konica was over several years, on this targeted programs that we were running with teams from across Europe and Asia Pacific, like 6 to 8 months, where we basically took them through, on one hand, capability sharing, so taking them through what's the human-centered design process, how do you conduct research, etc., but also working with them on very strategically relevant topics, for example, using a certain kind of technology or using a certain country where there's like a challenge around whatever the printer setup, etc., and working with them on solution development. On one hand, transferring our knowledge and giving them expert guidance. On the other hand, making sure that the people who are working within those markets, within that organization, that they are able to actually really own that solution, and hopefully after that program are able to continue to run it, which goes back to the whole idea of the ecosystem. It's like, yes, we come in as experts who can come up with solutions, but in order for solutions to be successful, someone on the other side has to take them over.
Yeah. And I think that's what's so important about that. So for instance, everything that all the solutioning we've done for organizations, governments in Singapore isn't necessarily transportable. It's not like we could fly into Cyprus one day and say, hey, we did this in Singapore, you do it exactly the same way.
Yeah.
I think more importantly, it would be working with people on the ground, getting them to go through that co-creation process so they also become co-authors in their own solution. And that affords many things. That affords not just a feeling of like community where they've helped to build it, but also a feeling of ownership as well as a feeling of acceptance. You get people's buy-in when you bring them on the journey.
Okay, so a couple of things I want to unpack here. So you discussed about how you guys approach design and see design. I think I want to step back a little bit and maybe get your maybe definition, let's say, of what is design. Because if you get like a traditional undergrad student, let's say, who just finished now university and they did like, I don't know, any kind of basic design, can be from graphic design to product design to, I don't know, branding or anything that revolves around that field. What you guys are talking about now is probably something very alien to that undergraduate because it's kind of steps very forward. So let's start with what is design, moving slowly to how do you get to the stage where you guys are and you guys see design and approach design. And then I want to hear how you guys manage to actually get clients, because
$100 million question.
Yes. Okay, so let's go with the
Definition of
definition.
design. I can go. You want to go first?
No, you go for it.
I will go first, and I also, because this is actually a very, I wouldn't say mean, but it's a definitely difficult question. So I'm gonna make the definition very simple, and by no means it's gonna be complete, etc. Because I also don't think there should be a like set in stone. This is the final definition of design. But maybe we can just outline a few things that design normally encompasses. So I think there's definitely something around defining a problem or challenge. That you're looking for a solution from. And I'm sure Jeff has a lot of thoughts on like solution and problems, but let's start with that. So basically, there's the aspect of solving for a problem, finding a solution. There's the aspect of having an actual tangible outcome. What the tangible outcome could be, I'll get back to that in a second. And I think it's also very important for a designer to be very conscious about the impact that the solution has, and the impact in regards to, because there will be a client involved. You're designing for someone. You're ideally also designing with someone, but they will have someone who will give you the brief. And even if you set the brief yourself, you have to answer to that. So you want to make sure that you fulfill the brief, that it's feasible, it's viable, it's technically feasible, it's viable as it can actually commercially run. It is what people are asking for, or whoever you're trying to solve the problem for, and it's the right thing to do. So the impact on the environment, on the society, on the community is not negative, or you minimize the knowable negative outputs impact as much as possible. And now, and this is something that might be a useful framework to look up, and Jeff was pointing at that briefly already before. This is idea of spheres of design. This has been an academic framework developed by many people, for example, Richard Buchanan, but also Peter Jones, looking at the different spheres that design can act within or happen within. And we have like the most, and the spheres is not by any means like a hierarchy or importance or anything, but you have maybe the most straightforward is the idea of you designing symbols. It can be you design a poster, you design a logo. The next sphere would be that you design objects, so the chair we talked about, or an ultrasound device, or whatever. It's like a thing that you that you then next sphere interact with. And so when you go like symbols, objects, next spheres interaction, that immediately shows that this is not a hierarchical list, because if you have interactions, you immediately bring the symbol and the object together. So how do I actually interact with this object? So you're designing this interaction. This can also be an interaction between people and interaction between various parties. And then we go bigger and bigger. So for example, the healthcare example we talked about before, that's an interaction, an experience, a service. Going all the way to, are we actually now thinking about designing systems? You could now see you can't actually design systems, you can only influence systems, but you can see how basically we are continuously expanding our view of like how big the problems are that we're trying to interact with or trying to design for. But you could also say maybe the problems are not getting bigger, just our view of them are getting bigger. So if we're actually now designing a phone bill, which we, for example, did for the largest telco in Singapore, we redesigned their phone bill. Yes, it's about the good design, the good information hierarchy, the good typography on this bill, that it's easy to read, that it's very clear, it's answering to the needs. But you're also then thinking about, okay, you're basically you're designing the interaction of your consumer with a big organization. You're also designing the experience of like what happens when I can't pay my bill, what happens if I have any kind of conflict with what you say that I owe you. You're designing that experience as well. But you could also see in a wider lens, and you're actually designing the whole interaction of like, what are my rights as a consumer towards this this big MNC, this big organization. So as a designer, you can continuously expand your perspective. It would be a lot to ask immediately when you come out as a graphic designer who is like able to design the bill to immediately see all of that. But you will, as you go through your career, more and more open up your perspective. And I think that's the challenge you should set yourself continuously to push this boundary.
Okay, so if I understand it correctly, we start with symbols, which is something very basic, just like the example you said, like a poster. Then we go with object, which is a bit more elaborate. It could be a chair, it could be a stool, it could be a table, it could be something physical that exists in the physical world. Then we go with interaction, so you start to think about how people will use that specific creation that you did. And then when we go to systems, it's basically kind of multiple interactions working in parallel, working together to form a coherent system where it's like everything needs to coexist in a way that makes sense.
Yeah.
I mean, you put it in a way that it's embedded in one another, and that's the way it is. Like if you design an app icon, that app icon represents an app that sits on a phone that's maybe an iPhone that's part of the Apple ecosystem. That so even if you're designing just symbols, it's not a belittling of your practice. In fact, that symbol has impact across all of those other spheres.
Yeah.
Right? So it's always trying to situate yourself within that. Maybe just to follow up really quickly on what Karin mentioned too about designers as problem solvers. So I also happen to have a PhD in engineering, just throwing it out there.
Of course, random conversation.
But I find that engineers are actually really good at problem solving. I find designers are actually second best at problem solving. But where designers excel in is problem discovery, problem defining, problem articulation. And if you articulate a problem incorrectly and try to solve for that incorrect articulation, the outcome's always going to be bad. So I think what designers have started to realize is that we're not just looking to solve problems, we're looking to actually ask, is this the actual problem? How can we better articulate this problem? And there's a need to articulate that because back to the idea that the designer is kind of useless sitting by themselves in a room.
Yeah.
Like if you put me in a room and said design something without any other context, I'd be like, okay, here's a layout maybe, or here's an illustration. But the moment you put a designer plus one, a designer sitting with a doctor, or a designer sitting with a social worker, all of a sudden the designer becomes a force multiplier. So I think going back to what design is, especially for us oldies versus maybe recent graduates of design, I think design is always going to be that force multiplier for other disciplines. I think that's where we have the best value, which is why I mentioned before how we can be facilitators. It's really about taking your design skills and applying that into many different areas of expertise, bringing in those expertise to do something good.
And it's very interesting for me that you said basically to identify the problem, because I would assume that very often the client might not even know what the problem is,
Exactly.
right?
Yeah.
Exactly. And that's where you can charge more. Like that's moving upstream as a designer, where you can help them uncover what the actual challenge is. You can help them validate that challenge. So before you even design a solution, there's a whole important process to kind of scope that project and make sure that what you're working on is a valid challenge. So testing that, validating that, making sure that it's defined well before you even write a brief to design something is somewhere where the designer can actually do work as well. And that's where we've done our work mostly.
And that maybe goes to responding a little bit to the other question you had, like, how did you find clients? And of course, this is, again, like very localized, like mostly in our experience working in Southeast Asia, a little bit in Europe. Is that exactly what Jeff was just pointing to? This scoping a project with a client is actually really, really important, which often is, I wouldn't say easier, but a different context for private sector, because there you have a more direct conversation and you ideally maybe even know the budget, but you kind of like can have the conversation. What do you need? What's the actual problem? Like what is currently not working, or what are you aiming to achieve? And then what's the best way of getting there? In the public sector, and it might be similar here, I'm pretty sure it's similar here in Cyprus, like within the European Union, you always have to go for procurement, which is completely understandable, and there are very good reasons to have this very structured and regulated way of procuring work. But it very often starts off with a very clear brief, which can often lock you in. It's like, okay, we think that XYZ is what we need, and we're going to procure XYZ for this amount of budget. And then what has happened time and time again is that you within this system of the procurement, once you start actually working on a project, you start to like meander your way through and, okay, how can we shift that around and make this less rigid? And what we have seen in Singapore is, and also, and for me, that is also a very important part of the creative work, as the work of the designer, being a facilitator, finding ways to working with people even before the project start and helping them scope it, having informal conversations and helping them make sense of the problem or the challenges. It's not even a problem. Okay, what's currently not working, or what's kind of hurting or itching, or where do you want to build a better future? And then having these conversations with them in order to help them better understand and better articulate what they actually need, so you can respond to that. And I think that is actually something that is really, really important, and that designers are well set up to do. But it's also a thing not really taught in education.
I mean, the designer, when you leave school, at least when I left school, I was taught to be a service provider.
Yeah.
I was taught to be, client needs something, you make that thing.
You get a brief with everything listed out.
Yeah.
Exactly.
A timeline that never
And,
changes.
and as a young designer, the more briefs you work in as a service provider, the more you begin to question, like, whoever wrote this brief doesn't know what they're asking for. And then that compelled us to start thinking like, okay, well, before you even put this brief out, let's have a conversation of what you think you want.
Yeah.
And so I think that's where we've managed to kind of move upstream. And I think a lot of designers are moving in that direction too.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, looking again this hierarchy of ideas that you mentioned, and I'm trying again to kind of think how would that work in Cyprus. Like, I would definitely say that we do have designers working in symbol, object, and interactions for sure, but I am not sure how much we actually consider systems. And my question would be actually, how do you get a big company, or most importantly the government, when they are designing a service, to kind of realize the importance of system design, and how do you actually get them to basically consider this from the beginning? Is it
I always say that the good creative practitioner's sales pitch is not a pitch at all. It's actually it's a portfolio of work. It's examples. And so I think it's very hard to convince someone just by telling them.
Yeah.
I think showing some excellent examples of that, which we have many of, how, for instance, the Singaporean government embraces design to, do all of their citizen engagement, for instance. I think these are great examples that maybe need to be seen. I think that's one way to do it. The other way to do it is screw clients. Like think about no, seriously, think about the client. We talked about this, a clientless project.
Yeah.
So if you're a young designer in Cyprus and you want to see how can I work designing systems more, you have whole communities, you have your community that is in need of innovation. It's in need of transformation. They just don't have anyone to do it because A, they're running a business, they don't have time, etc. You as a designer can be that person. So you don't necessarily need to wait for a big business or a government. You can offer that as a service first. And I say that lightly because I think if you're a young designer, building out your portfolio is just as important as getting a paycheck, in my personal opinion.
Jeff, I know you for many years. During the university, you had a website called Fuck You Pay Me.
Yes.
Who is going to pay them?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So maybe let me respond to that. And I completely understand the notion, and we definitely also as a company try to have this clientless project because it's important to have this freedom. But I think there is also a way in between, like just show my portfolio and clientless projects. And it's likely a combination of both. I think showing that this has worked somewhere else is very important, and it's not our work. I mean, there's also within Europe. You have in the UK, you have in the Netherlands, for example, and in other countries, very successful examples, specifically of municipalities, of governments working with designers and working in a co-creative process. So just proving that it actually has worked. I think that's very important. Also to de-risk. No government is willing to take risk. No municipality. The second thing is to actually take them on an experience, like actually take them through parts of the process. And I think very important is also to be humble, because a designer just trying to be pardon my French, the smart ass and coming in, oh, I know everything, how we solve this. That's not what design is there for. That's not the forte of design, and it's not very useful. So the thing is actually going in with curiosity and empathy to say, okay, we want to run, for example, at 1 day, 2 day, whatever, 2 half-day session with the key stakeholders. It could be from the municipality and from communities to understand, first of all, what is the problem? What are the challenges on the ground? Get the different voices together. And then together figure out, okay, what are maybe potential leverage points where you could start? So this could maybe be something that you do free of charge, and then you go into actually charging when you go into the problem solutions, the solution development. But I think it's very important to pick them up, to show them what is possible, to be very clear about the benefits of involving, for example, the different stakeholders. So not just the mayor, but also the head of the local business association and the neighborhood watch and the grannies that always sit in the square, everyone together, hear the voices, and then show them what could be. Give them a flavor of the vision and give them a flavor of what it would look like if people are actually bought in. And then say, okay, now we're going to pick one project and actually make it a success. Have this flagship project. Small scale, start there, sandbox it, but very importantly, get people on board, let them actually feel the process and let them feel empowered, and give them the ownership.
Yeah. No, I absolutely right. And as I'm conscious a little bit about the time, I want to ask you about something else. What do you think is the future of design? Where do you see a next step, an evolution? Where do you think we're headed?
In my opinion, the future of design has to be, now we call it sustainable design, circular design, whatever, but I think the future of design just has to be a very clear awareness and responsibility of all forms of design, of all skills, to work towards a sustainable transformation, meaning being very clear about what we design and how we design it, being very clear about what we don't design, because that's also a very important point.
What we don't design.
That we don't need to, like, every problem, every inconvenience, everything that doesn't work properly, we'll add another design to that, a new feature, a new product that fixes that. I think it's very important to actually make design an important tool to move towards a different way of living. And it can be that by designing products in a way that they last longer. It can by designing services that actually enable us to get things repaired or taken back, or sharing economies that are set up. It's by designing digital services in a way that they, for example, not everywhere there has to be an AI feature. Being very conscious about how we use technology, how we use materials, and how design actually can help envision and materialize a new, more sustainable lifestyle.
Yeah, I mean, for me, it's exactly the same. I think every job is a sustainability job from now on. If we consider the climate crisis to be real and permeating every aspect of our life, then for the designer, as now a green collar worker, should be thinking about planet-centric design and regenerative design. We should be thinking beyond the human or the user or the customer as the supremacy within your work, but actually just another component in a much larger system that also includes your natural services, your natural systems, sociocultural systems. So I feel like the designer really should be moving into kind of these areas, and quite honestly it affords a renaissance in design, because like previously in the 20th century we were designing for convenience. Everything was disposable, but now the new designer can design for repairability, for replaceable parts, for longevity. And this new constraint, our environmental and economic constraint, actually affords designers more possibilities to design differently.
Okay.
And so I'm aligned with Karin. I feel that design is should be moving towards, I guess you could call it a responsible way to design. Yeah.
Okay, so let me question a little bit about that. So you go to a client who doesn't share the same values as you guys, and they're like, yeah, you know what, I don't care about the planet.
You don't tell them.
Yeah.
You hack the system from within.
Yeah, but they might sit down and say, okay, why are you guys doing this? And if the answer is
Well, I
the
think-
planet sustainability, it will be like, yeah,
So
cut it.
let me answer that first in a very simple way. Their business will be illegal in the next 10 years because every developed economy is moving towards all types of regulations around their carbon tracking, their energy usage, waste generation. And so every organization will eventually need to report their sustainability impact. So all of these activities, whether you care about the environment or you're just here to make money, will be affected because of this new regulations that EU is imposing, that Singapore is imposing. So it's just a matter of legality, actually. Even if a company does not want to be sustainable, they will need to produce a report to file, along with their taxes, their carbon impact. So they'll have to. I'm sorry to say, like, it's just an inevitability, actually.
And maybe a less confrontational but still valid point is also that actually a lot of the green solutions or greener ways of designing can also be, maybe not on an immediate short term, but are on a long term actually cheaper. If you think about how can I design something that uses less energy, less resources, that lasts longer, and then I can look at actually not just selling something one time, but getting it back, refurbishing it, and selling it another time, that actually on the long term makes more business sense. So it is I'm not by no means saying that this is an easy sell. I agree that it's inevitability. It will happen. I hope it happens faster than currently, and not just like in 10 years we are legal, but it will happen, and it makes business sense to work like that. There is like resources that will run out. There's like changing legislation. There's changing consumer requests, etc. So it will happen. It's just about, as a designer again, being able now, next to designing your products and services, to also being able to actually sell your services with a clear vision that you can give your client. Like, why is this relevant?
Yeah.
And not because I hug trees, but it's relevant because then your business will stay relevant, and it's relevant because it's going to use less energy and resources, and it's going to look good on your balance sheet.
Okay. Well, right now, you guys, I guess you're both at the stage in your career where you can choose who you want to work for. So if your values do not kind of align with the client, it's easy for you to say, okay, I'm not interested to working with this organization or this person. But I want to take you back a couple of years because I want to kind of go into this a little bit more. I want to see how you guys thought about the design and about the world when you are actually while you are actually building your career and building your character and you're finding your niche as designers. Freshly graduates, you find a client that tells you to work on a brief that you don't agree with their work ethic. Would you do the work, or would you tell them to?
It's very hard to think post-rationally with that.
Yeah.
If I'm very honest with myself, it would have probably been like, do whatever it takes.
Do whatever it takes.
Yeah.
The reason I'm asking, sorry, is just to put this into context. Is I think the new generation takes this kind of stuff much more seriously than maybe we did. And this is for a number of reasons. There's no reason to go into them, but they're much more conscious. Yeah. And I think they are much more willing to say, I don't want to do this to someone just for the money. And they might be willing to work at the Starbucks basically and get paid like lower salary and find clients that they actually want to work for, also teams that they want to work for. Yeah. They're not just going to go to any employee and just be that, which is great.
I think you need to be discerning, and I think it's great that people are discerning because it also gives them a moral center. But I think we have to recognize that in order to make that decision in the first place, you need to be in a position of privilege to even have that as an option for yourself. So yes, there are probably many designers out there who come from upper middle class families that can say, screw this, I'm not working for this company because of my morals. But you have an equal amount of designers who do not have that luxury, who just need to get some money and eat, that may make that decision differently. So I think it's important to have a center ethic. But I think that ethic is going to be flexible for many different life positions, right?
I think it's also fundamentally, of course, like a personal position and a personal decision.
Yeah.
And I applaud anyone who has a very clear moral compass at that age. I am not sure that I had that. And I know that me going, for example, working in advertising, always freelance, but still, like I did enough internships and freelance there to know, for example, why I don't like that industry, at least 15 years ago, 20 years ago. And as much as I wouldn't do it nowadays anymore, for many reasons, the kind of products that you're advertising, the whole idea of like perpetuating overconsumptions, etc., etc. But having actually worked in that industry gave me a very clear understanding of what I like and what I don't like. And I think that is also very important. And I think maybe one thing that might sometimes be a bit difficult to fully see at that age, because I had it as well, you're not married to your job, especially when you start out your career. It's completely fine to do something for a year or for half a year, do an internship, and then change and say, like, I'm not going to go back there to this kind of industry, to this kind of organization, to this team, whatever it might be. But trying it out will actually give you that. If you don't like it, leave.
Yeah.
But if you don't know, try it out.
I think that's the point. I think irregardless whether you're willing to work for Prada or not, I think it is coming in with a level of criticality. I think every designer should be constantly critical about the work that they're doing, because A, that just makes better work, but B, it also lets you form an opinion. Much to what Karin said, you should try as much as you can, not necessarily to find out what you like, but to find out what you don't like, what is against your ethics in terms of the way that you want to work. But then ultimately, I think all of these things enable a good designer or creative practitioners because it builds a confidence. So irregardless of what skills you pick up or what network you're doing, you're trying to be part of, I think having a confidence in your practice, which includes feeling very comfortable with failure, because knowing that is a kind of learning moment, I think that confidence is the hardest thing to obtain. And a lot of designers, a lot of artists will cease to become designers or artists, not because they're not good creative practitioners, but because they just simply do not have the confidence to continue. The last failure for them was too hard. And, I don't want to do this anymore. I'm going to go sell insurance or something else or work at a bank. So I think the most important thing as a young designer is what are the things that you can do to build up that confidence, and that may include taking a job that you think is against your moral perspective, and then realizing, oh yeah, it's really against my moral perspective because now I've gotten a look under the skirt, so to speak, and I know this better. Or maybe it changes your mind. Maybe you get another perspective, and yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, really interesting. And some other questions kind of related to this. What's your approach on? Basically, I'm trying to figure out the soft skills which are kind of ideal and necessary for a designer. So there is that cliche that designers are kind of unique individuals, then they can get away with things. When you go to a client meeting, how would you guys dress? How would you guys behave? Would you pay any importance to that, or do you think that is irrelevant?
I think this question you cannot answer without being very aware of who you are. I mean, as a woman, I can't say I don't care about it. That would be lying blatantly. When I was younger, I dressed to look older because you're not getting taken serious. Now, having reached a certain age and having some gray hair, it's a lot easier. And also, very importantly, working as a white woman in Asia, a lot easier. There definitely is something to be said that as designers, you generally do get away with a lot more, but it's not endless unless you have a certain age and a certain position. Like if you're a design director, owner of a company, you can pull off a lot of stuff and be like, whatever, I'm like the big joker.
Yeah.
So there's definitely more freedom. But I think it's also very important to be aware what you can and cannot do, and be very aware. Play it. There is a system. It's getting better. The hierarchies are breaking down, especially more in Europe than in Asia. In Asia, they're also slowly crumbling, but they're still there. And to pretend that there's something like intersectionality is not there is being very naive. It matters your age, it matters your background, it matters your race. All that matters. What you can do as a designer, play with it.
Yeah.
Be very, like what we do it in our team. We try to be very low hierarchy. But there is, of course, some seniority, and clients will regularly ask for the director to be there because they feel that it's getting more attention. I still believe that my team can do it without me, but if I know that client will take us more serious and the project will be smoother if I rock up there, I will be there to support.
Like, knowing yourself encompasses all these things. Knowing yourself is understanding a confidence of your identity, but it's also a level of criticality because you know what you're not and what you are. So understanding the self, which sounds super philosophical, is the very first step. And the reason why I put this down is because I think building upon knowing yourself, you can extend that out into the way that you interact with the world, including clients. So if you have a core set of values, your values ground you. This is who you are. But those values need to be articulated. And so you articulate those as principles. These are the ways that these principles I adhere to in my life so that my values are preserved. But in order to act upon these principles, you need methodologies. You need methods in order to bring these principles to life. So this is the way that you feel. These are the methods that you use to conduct your work or interact with people or choose how you dress for your client interview. And then finally, there's the practices. These are the methods that are put into practice. And the methods get refined through practice and improved through practice. So if you look at it as kind of a triangle of hierarchy with values, principles built on those values, methods to enact those principles, and then the act of practicing those methods, this gives you kind of a holistic viewpoint of how your career can move forward.
It basically experience kind of brings all together, so you can understand how to practice it. And okay, so you're both very articulate, you're both very elegant in speaking. Do you think that kind of helped in your career? And what would you advise someone who might not naturally have these gifts? Because everybody needs to deal with clients. Do you think like maybe teamwork or like finding the right partner would be? Do you think practice? How would you advise someone who kind of doesn't feel like they can reach this?
You hit it. You hit the nail on the head. I think one of it is a storytelling thing. So listening to good stories, telling good stories is one thing, because telling a good story will do everything from position your research findings to, asking for the right budget. You know, I think that's one thing. I think working with partners is really important as well. I think working alone in a bubble, you can only do so much. So it's fine if you're not the business development person. Like, find the partner who enjoys that, and try to find confidence and an understanding and a trust, so that you can work beyond your means, and you do that through your partnerships.
And I think it's definitely building onto that. It's also about practice. As we see that time and time again with our team, many of them, there will be the few exceptions that come in and they're very like, okay, I want to be in front of our clients and I want to do this, I want to do that, who are very keen to speak up. Most people who go into design prefer to like sit behind their screen and do their thing, no matter if it's digital or physical, doesn't matter. But I would always say, and what we do so in our team, challenge them, put them out and start small. Okay, we're gonna run a workshop. You're gonna facilitate just a table of 4 people. Just on the table level, you're gonna interact with them. You're gonna take them through the exercises. You're gonna co-create a solution. So with small steps, getting more and more comfortable, not just to then eventually like be the big business development person, but also for you as a designer in your practice. If you actually want to be someone that can work not only for people, but with people, you have to get more comfortable with actually talking to the people that you're designing with. And it's not that you have to be always like super polished and like super articulate. It's just being on a very personal level, like understanding them and understanding where they're coming from. And that's actually something that most people are very comfortable with if they get the hang of it, because it's actually less you talking and more you asking good questions. And I think the other thing is just find someone that you think is very good at and just follow them around. As much exposure as possible. Just like follow them in every meeting, try to like assist them, and then you'll learn from that. That's how I learned.
Nice. Awesome. And I mean, you guys are partners in business. You're also life partners. You don't want to kill each other some days?
Oh, regularly.
That's a project still in the working. Yeah. But yeah, somehow we've managed it. We've worked very closely for some organizations. We've lived in around 7 different countries together.
Studied together.
It takes a lot of work, to maintain a relationship, as everyone knows. Yeah.
Great. Okay, and last thing, since we started with watches, Jeff, I know you're a watch guy. Karin, I don't know, are you a watch person?
As a designer, I appreciate the look of watches and the design. I'm more impartial to the brand. I don't like Rolex at all. I think they're ugly.
Okay.
But this one is a very nice one.
So, 5 watches.
5.
You don't have to count in the budget. You have unlimited budget.
Wow.
You cannot sell the watches.
Sure.
So don't go like Philippe Patek, diamond encrusted and of those. Just like 5 watches you will, at this stage in your life, you would like to have in your collection and you're going to use them and wear them.
Sure. I mean, I would separate them by activity, I guess. So 5 watches, definitely some type of Casio or G-Shock, because you need something that actually can tell the time all the time. And then, of course, I mean, I would love to have an A. Lange & Söhne. I think like a Zeitwerk is probably my grail watch. And then, maybe like a steel sports watch from Rolex that I can use for gardening. And
of course, because everybody gardens with the Rolex.
Exactly.
You can start gardening right when you get back home.
And probably like a Seiko, some type of Seiko field watch. There's so much to choose from.
Oh yeah, there are. You want to hear mine?
Yeah, definitely.
I would probably go with Oyster Perpetual light blue Rolex. Sorry, Karin. I mean,
I'm used to that. Don't worry.
Yeah, I would. I'm more of a jeans and a t-shirt guy, so I think that really works well. Simple, sporty.
Yeah.
Cartier Tank. I like that. Classy. More of a classy, dressy look. Omega Speedmaster.
Yeah.
The new
classic
one,
design too.
Dark Side of the Moon,
Yeah.
which also happens to be my favorite album
Pink
of all
Floyd
time.
album.
Yes. Junhan's Max Bill.
Yeah.
I mean,
Beautiful.
designed by
That is great.
Design Idol. So
Yeah.
Yeah.
how away can you go? And probably a summer watch between. No, I'll go for an Nomos. I'll go for.
Okay.
No, I was going to say
Classy
between,
all the way.
Yeah.
I like your list of 5 more than yours.
Classy all the way.
Okay, thank you. Thank you guys so much for this conversation. I hope it was nice and useful for you too to kind of talk about your life's work, and it was great having you here, and we can
Yeah.
call it a day.
Thanks, Doros.
Thank you.
Let's
Thanks
go
for
have
the
some
space
beers.
and time of reflection. It actually helps. Thanks.
Excellent. Thank you.
Great.